Hi everyone. So for my presentation, I decided to take more of an intersectional approach and do it on something a bit different than we've been learning this year. So my presentation is titled Addressing the Social, Economic, Political, and Healthcare Barriers Faced by Women with Disabilities in Low-Income Countries. And then I tried implementing strategies for WHO policy reform and ways in which we can ensure that everyone's included within the healthcare system, and then as well as all the other factors that are directly connected to the healthcare system, because as we all know, like education, employment, all these various factors play a huge role in access to healthcare. Like if one does not have a stable job, they're unable to get access to healthcare. And then education, of course, leads to a stable job. So we have all these interconnected factors that have a significant impact on the healthcare system. And so I really want to take a look at who is most affected within society, and specifically like all these, like looking at specifically at triple vulnerabilities, double vulnerabilities, because oftentimes when we look at marginalized populations, we only look at them in one context, and that is extremely and yet by only looking at them in one context, then we, of course, we do the same thing as we continue to do over and over again, which is, of course, generalize specific populations, and then by generalizing populations, we're generalizing the healthcare system, which leads to further inadequacies and inequities within our healthcare system in Canada, as well as in various healthcare systems around the world and intergovernmental organizations, and specifically the WHO. So to start off, I'm just going to talk about why I chose this topic specifically. So personally, like I've always been passionate about the topic of intersectionality, and of course, from both personal experiences and from listening to politics, I've developed a particular passion for disability-related rights, because in politics, they rarely discuss the importance of disability. It's never, ever a topic that is discussed within politics. I believe it was actually discussed for the first time at the Democratic debate. The 2019 Democratic debate in September or October, they discussed it for the very first time, and they consistently generalized populations of disabled persons, because persons with disabilities usually live in low-income contexts. If you look at the rates of poverty, the majority of the people living in poverty also have a disability, and additionally, because of inadequacies within the healthcare system, people with a disability and also living in poverty face even further marginalization as a result. And so I was really fascinated by this topic, because essentially the current healthcare system here in Canada and the US, like all around the world, excludes persons with disabilities who additionally face another vulnerability. Like for example, if we were to take into consideration women with disabilities, they face, and specifically in lower income countries, in developing countries where gender inequality is very much prevalent, not only do they face gender inequality, but then they also have a disability on top of that. And so that further excludes them from the healthcare system, from their ability to obtain a proper job, access to education, all these various factors that play a huge role in ensuring quality of life and equitable access to healthcare. So throughout my presentation, I'll be really touching on a variety of different topics that are connected to the healthcare system, but ways in which we can ensure that everyone is included, specifically women with disabilities. I focus specifically on women with disabilities. There are a bunch of other vulnerabilities that could further marginalize a woman with a disability in society. For example, racialized women with disabilities, they face, there have been several studies conducted in terms of Indigenous women with disabilities. So essentially, it's really important to understand how all these different vulnerabilities are interconnected within society, and how it's really important to take into account the intersectionality when addressing a variety of different issues, because disabilities are prevalent within every single population, within every single country, within every single context, and yet it's the least addressed within the healthcare system, which leads to further inadequacies that currently exist, and that will still exist if we do not ensure that every single aspect within the healthcare system, within the education and political and policy framework pertains to persons with disabilities, and there is a specific sector that ensures their representation within policy. the importance of intersectionality. So as I previously stated, taking an intersectional approach is really important within healthcare and ensuring that we address people who may be facing multiple vulnerabilities. And so, for example, within my presentation, I wanted to explain how disability, gender inequality, and poverty are closely interlinked and result in severe circumstances in the context of immediate access to social services, employment, and healthcare. Lack of access to social services and employment leads to further lack of access to healthcare because, like everything, of course, within communities and within societies are all interconnected. If one lacks adequate access to education, then they're going to lack adequate access to healthcare, etc. So we need to ensure that within every aspect of our within a country, that people are able to access each and every single thing. Because if they lack access to one thing, then it lacks access to another. And now I'm going to be talking about disability in the context of poverty. And so the majority of individuals with a disability live in poverty in low-income contexts, and there has in fact been little reform by the WHO to address such inadequacies. The WHO simply stating that the majority of persons with disability live in low-income contexts is not adequately addressing the situation at hand. And specifically, if you look at the statistics, they do not address the importance of gender, because if you look at the number of individuals within low-income contexts that are with the disabilities, the majority of them are women. If you were to compare that to our average population, then the disparity between men and women living with disabilities in low-income contexts is significantly greater. And so if you look at the graph here, you'll see that the majority of persons and people living in poverty are in fact disabled compared to persons without disabilities, which goes to show that there has been limited reform regarding equitable access to healthcare, to social services, to education, because within disability and healthcare barriers, of course, persons with disabilities lack adequate access to healthcare, not only because healthcare systems are inaccessible for persons with wheelchairs, persons with intellectual disabilities, persons with sensory disabilities, but because people don't have a coherent framework that ensures that each person with a disability is able to get access to a healthcare system. Oftentimes, when people think of accessibility in healthcare, they think of ensuring that there are ramps implemented within hospitals to ensure that people with wheelchairs are able to get through. But the term disability is oftentimes not properly defined. And so as a result, because it's not properly defined, then a lot of people will misinterpret the importance of accessibility. Like, for example, not all disability pertains to physical accessibility. Like, there are a multitude of different disabilities, and the majority of them are not actual physical disabilities. A lot of them can be intellectual disabilities. A lot of them can be psychological. A lot of them can be sensory-based disabilities. And so another thing, too, is because when implementing an accessibility-based approach within healthcare systems, a lot of the time people tend to generalize the disabled population. And the thing with disability is that you cannot take a one-size-fits-all approach. The one-size-fits-all approach that we currently have implemented within all of the healthcare systems across the world is detrimental to more marginalized groups, because it generalizes the entire population. And so the same thing goes with disability, because everyone experiences disability differently. And people have different, of course, people with disabilities have a variety of different backgrounds. And so because of the fact that the healthcare system generalized persons with disabilities, then that leads to further inadequacies within the healthcare system as a result. So again, throughout the year, we've talked a lot about the one-size-fits-all approach that healthcare systems tend to take. And it's important to not take this one-size-fits-all approach when addressing accessibility-based needs, because, of course, everyone has a different set of accessibility-based needs, and we need to ensure that each person is able, that there's a coherent system implemented that ensures that every individual who may need to get access to healthcare is able to do so in a way which they can personalize it. And now I wanted to talk more about the social model of disabilities and various social barriers in accessing proper education, a job, and then healthcare, of course. So within social barriers, you have the environment, attitudes, and organizations. So within environment, a lot of environments are considered to be inaccessible. Buildings, language, communication, and services are all very much inaccessible. So this is more of a, if you were to think of within specific environments, so for example, within a hospital environment, then a lot of buildings could potentially be inaccessible. Within a university, maybe a lot of buildings are inaccessible. Maybe a lot of services are inaccessible because they don't address the specific needs of persons with disabilities. Maybe the language is inaccessible. So, for example, persons with hearing disabilities, deaf individuals are unable to communicate with, maybe not be able to communicate with a lot of people as a result because they don't have access to a sign language interpreter, or they don't have access to a sign language interpreter that speaks their particular sign language, because sign language is not a universal language. It varies with every single culture and with every single country. A lot of people think generalized sign language and think ASL is, of course, the main, is what the entire sign language is considered to be, when in reality, like, every single country varies, their sign language varies differently. And so that's another really important factor to take into consideration. Like, persons with disabilities come from a variety of different backgrounds, and deaf individuals may, of course, speak a different sign language than you may think. So that's another thing, really important thing to take into consideration. And then, of course, communication barriers. So, like, persons with psychological, intellectual disabilities people may not be able to communicate with them as well, or maybe lack adequate services or adequate resources to ensure their proper communication. And so that's just a social barrier pertaining to the environment. Then in terms of attitudes, so prejudice, discrimination, and stereotyping, because a lot of people tend to stereotype people with disabilities. I feel like the least intentional one, though, like from my experience, is in terms of sign language, because a lot of people generalize sign language and they think that sign language is, of course, as I previously mentioned, that is a universal language, which of course is not, because within attitudes, a lot of the times people take a one-size-fits-all approach and assume that, like, the same needs of one person with a disability are the same needs as another person with disabilities, and it's basically saying that specific statement about the disabled population is basically saying the same thing about every single individual within society, because everyone has a distinct set of needs, and we need to ensure that there's a system put in place that allows people to personalize their needs and obtain adequate access to all these services by ensuring that these distinct set of needs are adequately addressed. And so, again, like, with stereotyping, discrimination, prejudice, a lot of it is deeply embedded within the environmental-based approach, and a lot of the psychological behaviors towards persons with disabilities result in an inaccessible environment. And then, moreover, with organizations, so of course throughout this presentation, it's focusing mostly on the WHO. I'm just trying to give some background information before going into specific strategy that the WHO should be taking to ensure that women with disabilities are able to adequately obtain access to a healthcare. And so within the organization, there inflexibility, procedures, and practices that are all very much inadequate, and that result in severe inequities that further marginalize persons with disabilities, because they do not address their specific needs, and they do not ensure that the distinct needs of persons with disabilities are adequately addressed. Like, there are a multitude of different things that should be adequately addressed. Like, for example, gender-specific needs, language-based needs. Like, persons with disabilities disabilities, of course, prevalent in every single population, and that's something that needs to be ensured within every single disability-related organization, within every single. now I'm going to compare the social model of disability versus the medical model of disability. So the medical model of disability is essentially extremely detrimental to the whole disability movement because it it makes it seem like the person with the disability is the problem, and it focuses all the attention on the issue specifically on the individual rather than on society, because like it's never the individual, it's always the barriers that are put in place that prevent people with disabilities from getting adequate access to education, services, and healthcare. And in comparison to the social model of disability, it focuses more so on currently existing barriers currently existing barriers that do not allow people to get access to important services. So by focusing strictly on the social model of disability and completely neglecting the medical model of disability, because the medical model of disability places all the blame and all the issues on the person with a disability, and it makes them seem like they're the problem when in reality it's society that is the problem. And so ensuring that by focusing on issues pertaining to the social model of disability and addressing each of those barriers, it will allow persons with disabilities and the diverse persons with disabilities adequate access to all services. We'll talk about disability and the feminist movement. So before moving on, within education and access to healthcare, this is also something that needs to be gender specific as well, because within lower income countries, oftentimes if a family has both a son and a daughter, they'll send the son to school over the daughter. Especially if the daughter has a disability, then that will even place her in an even further marginalized area. And so it's really important to address the importance of disability within both the feminist movement and then the importance of gender within the disability movement. So within the feminist movement specifically, the feminist movement has failed to address critical intersections of disability and gender. And then when addressing women's rights, we need to ensure that all women are able to contribute to this crucial discussion. Because again, with the women's movement, within any movement, they tend to generalize that specific population. And then as a result, they fail to address the distinct needs of specific individuals within that movement. And more so in the social context. So again, when we're talking about the social model of disability, we also need to address the fact that women with disabilities specifically face higher rates of violence and assault than women without disabilities, because they are vulnerable, and because of a lack of adequate access to education, to important social services, as well as lack of adequate access to healthcare, it increases their vulnerability and susceptibility to violence and to assault as a result. Disability in low-income countries. So if you were to compare disability in lower income countries to higher income countries, it's of course a lot more prevalent within lower income countries because they lack adequate access to education, to employment, to healthcare, which further exacerbates the presence of their disability. And so if you look at the graph there, then in every single country, it's a lot more prevalent within low and middle income countries, like specifically bipolar depressive disorder, because people are unable to obtain adequate access to treatment, as well as epilepsy, sclerosis, like all these various disabilities are much more prevalent within lower and middle income countries. And so when talking about the context, in the context of women with disabilities experiencing impoverished conditions while living in low-income countries face a triple vulnerability threat. Beforehand, I was talking about the double vulnerability threat, which was disability and gender inequality. But in lower-income countries, they also face extreme poverty. And so I use Yemen as an example. And so Yemen faces extreme poverty, and practically 38% of the rural population lives in absolute poverty. And the majority of the population that lives in absolute poverty has a disability. And so consequently, basic rehabilitation services for women with disabilities are completely unavailable, and almost 10% of the population lacks adequate access to social services. So social services, of course, are really important in ensuring that people are able to obtain access to healthcare services. And additionally, In Yemen, there is no provision of accessible buildings, and several people are denied access to education, employment opportunities, and of course, healthcare. Okay, so now I'm going to touch on the importance of feminism and the disability movement. So essentially, in the disability movement, particularly in countries in the Middle East, they're primarily dominated by men, because of course, because of the resulting disparities within access to education, access to obtaining a job, and then access to healthcare. Men are able to obtain leadership roles within the disability movement a lot more easily. And then as a result, since the disability movement is primarily dominated by men, women with disability, their needs are not adequately addressed. And because the disability movement essentially takes this one-size-fits-all approach, and by taking this one-size-fits-all approach, men with disabilities are much more prominently represented within the disability movement than women with disabilities, because then again, statistics on disability do not disaggregate by gender, which is detrimental and excludes a large population of persons with disabilities, specifically women with disabilities. So then I'm going to be moving on to strategies for policy reform. So specifically, strategies that can be taken by the WHO to ensure adequate access to healthcare. And by those means, by ensuring adequate access to healthcare, it also means ensuring adequate access to education and to social services, and then adequate access to obtain a leadership role within the disability or feminist movement. Okay, so to start off, I'm just going to give a brief statement about the strategy that I tried to implement for WHO policy reform. So to implement a coherent policy framework, the WHO needs to work closely with influential feminist and disability organizations, looking to beyond basic needs within healthcare and towards a strategic gender-based healthcare policy framework challenging sexism within the disability movement by generating this agenda and priorities and investing in research and communication initiatives. And so this is just a general statement about the strategies I tried to implement. And now for the first strategy, I state specifically equitable access to education through accessibility informed feedback from diverse populations, because there's within the disability movement, and when conducting research and within trying to gather a multitude of statistics, a lot of people, again, they take this one-size-fits-all approach, and then as a result, exclude the majority of persons with disabilities. So specifically, we need to look at disability in context of culture and context of gender as well. And those two contexts really need to be directly informed when providing adequate access to education. And additionally, I briefly touched on this before, but it's also really important to talk about implementing gender-specific statistics on disability. So when I talk about implementing gender-specific statistics, I talk about disaggregating disability statistics between men and women, because men and women with disabilities both have this very distinct set of needs. Equitable access to healthcare for all through an accessibility informed approach to all aspects of health, specifically for women with disabilities who lack adequate access to reproductive maternal healthcare services. And as I said before, the disability movement in the Middle East is primarily led by men, because they're able to obtain an education, obtain a job much more easily because of the very prominent levels of gender inequality within developing and lower income countries. And so ensuring that women are adequately represented within the disability movement is really important. And in order to ensure that, we need to allow more women to take on leadership roles within these organizations, and allow women to form their own disability-related organizations that address the distinct needs of women with disabilities. And then that basically concludes my presentation. I touched upon various strategies for policy reform, and then the importance of intersectionality. Be directly informed of women with disabilities, but the movement itself needs to have leadership from women with disabilities, both in the disability movement and then within the feminist movement. There needs to be more representation from women with disabilities. And so we need to absorb and integrate women's issues of disability and confront weaknesses, currently existing weaknesses within the disability movement and within the feminist movement that continue to limit and constrain social, economic, and health advancements of women with disabilities. So ultimately, through empowerment and through ensuring equitable access to education, to social services, and to healthcare, through proper representation and through proper research and statistics disaggregated by gender, then that will ultimately ensure that women with disabilities are adequately represented within society and within the healthcare system and ultimately within the WHO. Thank you all for listening to my presentation. I hope you all stay healthy. I hope you all stay safe. It's been a pleasure working with you all throughout the year. I have very much enjoyed all of our discussions. I wish you all the very best of luck and an amazing summer. Thank you.